brothers, do you recall when the grasslands reached to the horizon? And the deafening roar of countless wings overhead. Back when Rome was a village at Britain, the Emerald Island. Before we gave up on our future and buried our dead.
There you go.
Okay, people, we are on episode 30, and I cannot believe we're on episode 30. That's pretty damn cool. We are doing Africa today. We're doing early African civilizations that are not Egypt. And I will be very upfront. I'm not the most knowledgeable person on African history, but I'm going to do my best to cover, at least tantalizingly cover, some of those early civilizations and cultures and peoples. Of course, Africa is an enormous continent with a lot of history, about which, unfortunately, we know quite little for a number of reasons, partially because of the climatic conditions on the continent, partially because there have been a lot of people living there and migrating back and forth to the continent and from the continent throughout many centuries, partially because when the exploitation by the Europeans began quite actively towards the post-Renaissance period, basically, 1700s and on, a lot of archaeological sites have been lost, partially because archaeology on the African continent is A, still in its very early stages, and B, is very difficult presently, now that people have gotten interested enough and involved enough in actually doing archaeology in Africa. There's a lot of regions that are unfortunately not easily accessible, either for climate reasons or oftentimes because there is some sort of civil unrest or warfare going on in those regions. And hopefully in the next couple of centuries, scientists will be able to have a lot more access to very interesting regions, to which right now I know archaeological expeditions are pretty much being conducted at their own peril, with very, very high chances of bad things happening. Now, Africa, of course, as we all know, is the cradle of humankind. And we've talked about this quite a bit in our early episodes when we were talking about the beginning of Homo sapiens as a species, and not just Homo sapiens, Homo neanderthalis, and other hominid species. They all originated really in Africa. Even the species like Neanderthals, who are considered to be European humans, their ancestors still came from Africa. But very little, unfortunately, is known about early African history outside, of course, of Egypt, which is kind of its own separate thing, and which has been explored nearly to death by now. Again, I just want to repeat that, African history, especially early African history, is not my area of expertise. I want to at least give people an idea that it exists, so people can maybe look up some of these concepts and, some of these cultures on their own and maybe find more interesting information than I have been able to. Also, if anybody is listening to this, watching this podcast, who has more expertise, you're very welcome and invited to jump in at any point in time. And again, if those people who are watching this episode, who are watching our podcast in general, if you like what we're doing, please give us a like. If you hate what we're doing, please dislike us intensely and do a dislike. If you have something to comment, any thoughts, ideas, suggestions, references, arguments, please comment. That's very helpful. And also I wanted to send a shout out to Marwaen, whose material I'm using, and also Bushwhacker, who is another Russian podcaster, a lot of whose material I'm using. Thank you guys for your work and for putting this material out there. As we know, Africa was populated longer than any other continent, obviously, because humans originated there. Africa has had originally very comfortable climate for the early hominids. But as people evolved, as people changed, the forests in which they probably originally kind of evolved and appeared became not so welcoming to the early humans. So Africa, in a way, it is a very comfortable environment for the human species. And on the other hand, it presents a lot of challenges to the human species. First of all, Africa is not homogeneous. In its environments, there's a lot of different environments. There's, there's sands. There's, of course, rainforest. I would like to just show some pictures of that stuff. The rainforest in itself presents a problem because even though humans evolved in it, they have not, here it is, There's some pictures of the rainforest. They have not, they're not very well adapted to live there now. And this is, by the way, a picture from Bushwhacker's presentation. That kind of thick growth is very difficult for majority of humans to live in and to migrate in. Not only does it present heavy obstacles as far as undergrowth and all this greenery goes, but it also, there's another picture, but it also contains a lot of dangerous animals, snakes, spiders, hides predators. So of course there's the desert, as we all know, and humans are not very well adapted. The humans tried to adapt to the desert, but they didn't do so well. Majority of humans don't live in the deserts today. Some people did. And of course you have the savannah, which is that's the ancestral kind of territory. I'm sure everybody knows what it looks like, but nonetheless. So, I mean, majority of the territories that people used for migrations throughout Africa was something like this, which allowed people to have access to various animals, animal herds, to have access to tubulars and other plant materials, also have access to some sort of water, basically, and to have free passage that's not obstructed by all this undergrowth that you will see in the rainforest. Exploration of Africa, of course, did not begin until very late, because early on, when Europeans came to Africa and they found some traces of African civilizations, they immediately assigned them to the lost white civilizations and various mythical characters, and did not want to believe that these were native civilizations, native structures, native progress for a long time. A lot of these archaeological sites were just simply destroyed in the 19th century. You know, the archaeology was something along the lines of Indiana Jones, where people would come and pretty much pick up everything that wasn't attached, and if it was attached, they would dig it up and take it with them anyway. A lot of priceless artifacts, a lot of priceless information got lost in the process of looting of African archaeological resources and sites. Scientists are just barely starting to explore that region. The very first tool use that was seen in the world really was, it was the very first industry, and that was also dyes and colorants, and that was around 130, 150,000 years BC. It was Kenya, Tanzania, Congo River Basin, that sort of region. I mean, a lot of earliest tool making is found there. At the time we're talking about, of course, and up until more or less probably the last, I would say, 10,000 years, maybe even more recent than that, the modern African races have not been formed. Now, of course, there's not just one race in Africa. There's multiple peoples who live in Africa, and multiple types of African populations that are quite distinct from each other. And even though Europeans oftentimes kind of tend to clump all Africans as one group, I mean, there's very distinct languages with different language groups. There's very distinct morphological and racial types. But of course, this is something that formed very, very recently. And a lot of it is a result of admixture with various migrating peoples that came through one way or another. You know, some peoples are results of admixture with anything from Indo-Europeans to Semitic peoples. As we know, as I talked in our early Egypt episode, the Egyptian, I don't know what to call them, not even a race, kind of a commonality really was, you know, an admixture of Semitic tribes and more African tribes who came from two different sides of the River Nile when the desert started drying up on both sides and people were escaping that horrible drying region. And they came to this fertile valley of the River Nile. But a lot of different peoples, a lot of different populations, and a lot of different genetic groups exist in Africa, because Africa is the ancestral land of the peoples in general, of all peoples of this planet. The oldest, you know, it has the most genetic diversity. It has the most linguistic diversity. It has the most morphological diversity. It is now believed that some of very archaic groups may have survived in some regions of Africa. We're talking about very, very long time ago. We're talking about hundreds, you know, 1000 BC and so on and so forth, that pockets of more archaic populations may have survived here and there, that introduced their genetic flow to some of the later populations who came across them and might have admixed with them. So Africa is really our resource for genetic diversity, for, you know, human ability to provide because genetic diversity is what really matters if you're facing some sort of an external threat, whether it's disease or starvation or some sort of a sharp climactic catastrophe or change. It's your genetic diversity that really allows you to adapt as a species and survive that catastrophe in that difficult time. So in that sense, Africa is really a repository of human variability, and human plasticity. The race that originally most likely populated Africa, first of all, was likely not uniform because, the African continent is divided by rivers, it's divided by mountain ranges, it's divided by deserts and other impassable for human obstacles. But the people there most likely contained originally the traits of all the other races that later formed on this planet. Anything from, your Mongoloid traits to your Europeoid traits to everything and anything was already present on the African continent because that's where all those people ultimately came from. Even Neanderthals, as I have mentioned earlier, have their origins on the African continent. And so every trait that humans develop down the road, whether it's light skin, whether it's blue eyes, whether it's a particular height or body structure, all of that ultimately resided in Africa and came from African origin. So what are some of the earliest civilizations, if you would like to call them, peoples, cultures that exist in Africa? Well, first and foremost, do you want to jump in?
Yes.
Okay, David wants to jump in. I'm going to stop for a second and let him jump in.
Okay. Just to touch on the forest and the savannas. The forests were a great place for apes because they could swing around and dry up in the canopy. When we quit becoming arboreal apes and started moving down into the savannas, that's when bipedalism, we're talking 4 million years ago or something like that. That's where bipedalism and standing up to see over the grasses and being able to tell that the lion's creeping up on you. They think that move to the savannah was very crucial to bipedalism. On the tool industries, the earliest tool industries were about 2.5 million years ago. They were Homo habilis. What I think Julie's talking about is the earliest sapiens, what's commonly the blade technologies off of a core of stone. I think that will be the earliest sapiens associated. You had lots of Homo erectus had the hand axes and all of that, but really fine tools that are associated with sapiens come along in that period, 150,000 years or so ago. To support what she was saying about the diversity there of Africa, the most diverse that you can find between humans is not, say, or Inuit and a African. It would be like between neighboring villages in East Africa. So that shows you how long and how many influences have been there.
So, and I apologize, I have this in Russian, but it's pretty much self-explanatory. This is just a climatic map of Africa as we have it today. The pink areas are where you have high altitude locations, right? Obviously, the areas that you see in yellow are going to be your deserts and the half deserts. The green areas are your savannah and your kind of not very thick forest grows. These are wet equatorial forests right here. These are forests that have interchangeable, basically the purple and the deep green, they're both porous. So right here you have the savannas. And of course, right here at the edges, you have the, permanently perma-green or whatever you call them, the pines and conifers and stuff like that, forests right here. So that's just to show you that's, and I'm going to ask somebody to please pronounce this for me because this is going to be essential to us. Could somebody please pronounce this for me properly in English?
Niger.
Okay,
Yes, Niger.
make sure because it's pronounced one way, of course, in Slavic and another way in English, and I just didn't not want.
Niger.
Okay, so this is kind of important because we're going to be talking about some of these locations. Some of these locations are very key because the rivers, of course, in Africa were very important. The Congo River Valley, I mean, a lot of the sources of civilizations that we're going to be talking about was one way or another attached to these water, bodies of water and lakes. But this right here is a major source of civilization, and we will talk a little bit more about it. Just note the location is kind of in this letter L almost. Nile, of course, is that's where Egypt is. Lake Victoria is going to be a very big one. So this is just let me move you guys over so I can go on to my next image. But we might return this back to this image a little bit later on. And this is just a current, territory of Africa. Now, first of all, I wanted to talk about where some of the earliest cultures appeared. And the earliest cultures, of course, the reason why we don't have a lot of information about early cultures is because those early cultures were where Sahara now is. Now, we spoke about that a lot more in the early Egypt episode. Sahara used to be a very blooming savannah region with many rivers, with many lakes, with a lot of grazing, various cattle, and that's really where the earliest civilizations in Africa took place. Really, this is what eventually gave birth to the Egyptian civilization, because when Sahara dried up, as we remember from our Egyptian podcast, the people who used to populate it partially just died, partially adapted to living in those very arid, very dangerous for humans conditions, almost impossible for humans conditions, and partially fled to the river Nile Valley, and that's where they formed for part of the population that formed eventually the Egyptian civilization. And in a way, Sahara was the Atlantis for Egypt. All those stories that the Egyptians did not invent their own civilizations, that they didn't build the pyramids by themselves, that some mysterious technology of the ancient Atlanteans. Yeah, all of that, pretty much, if there was an Atlantis, it didn't drown, it drowned in sand, and that would have been the early Sahara civilizations. These people were actually quite amazing. First of all, they had ceramics really early on. They had early metallurgy. It was one of the very few sources of bronze actually in Africa, because in Africa there was a problem with tin. It's kind of the civilizations of the Fertile Crescent to get their tin, to make their bronze from copper. Because copper was very plentiful back in those times. I mean, today it's been pretty much all mined up, but back then it was something that you commonly found underfoot. But in order to make it into bronze, you had to have appropriate ingredients. And for those ingredients, people traveled as far as the British Isles back in those very ancient times. So in Africa, there was not a lot of sources of tin. And so bronze really appeared in one region, well, not counting, again, I'm excluding Egypt from our conversation mostly, but mainly it just appeared in these early Saharan cultures. And the second place where in Africa there was some there is found traces of bronze is actually Ethiopia, but there's a good indication that that bronze was imported from Egypt eventually through various routes. That's just some of the early, and this is what Sahara looks today, which is not very nice. Let's see. So these are some of the ancient lakes of Sahara. I mean, we will look at what it looks like now. I mean, Lake Chad is something else that we're going to talk about. It's very interesting, but Sahara was it had many plentiful rivers. It had a lot of grazing animals. The hunting there was incredibly well developed. The people did not really have wheels. They didn't have herding per se, but they didn't need to have agriculture or herding because the land was so plentiful. A lot of the crops pretty much grew wild. All they had to do is gather them and come back to their place where they would grow the next year or the next season. They already had ceramics. They didn't have wheels, but they had these kind of almost something like sled that they would drag along river valleys or along the sides of river valleys. They had access to a lot of plentiful and wonderful clay along those river valleys. Their level of bow and arrow, there's pictures, pictographs and various cave art, not cave art, but like rock art that depicts people with all kinds of different bows and all types of different arrows. Arrow tips were found in that area. So they had very highly developed hunting techniques. These people, they used throwing weapons, not just bow and arrow, but also various throwing weapons. They had pretty much achieved the level of Çatalhöyük, this civilization before it collapsed. And then this wonderful and beautiful civilization pretty much disappeared to almost nowhere. So that's going a little bit far. And the reason why we have so little information about the early Saharan civilization is because the sand came and it buried everything. And it is extremely difficult for archaeologists to excavate anything in a sandy environment because, I mean, there will be legends and even stories. I mean, I've listened to archaeologists talk about how somebody will be passing through some area of Sahara and see some ancient remains show up from under the sand. And then they will move, they will report those, and archaeologists will arrive and they're buried, and nobody can even recall where this spot was, even if they have accurate GPS symbols, because the sands, they shift and they cover everything up. And in order to even be able to excavate, especially in the heart of Sahara, I mean, you have to build walls, more or less cement walls that prevent the sand from shifting and covering up your stuff. And it still shifts and it still covers everything up. So excavations in those regions are very, very difficult. So what we have is we have around the edges of the desert where it's kind of starting to thin out, but unfortunately that desert is still spreading today. And there's, people there are fighting the spread of the desert. They're trying to plant various, plants and everything else around the edges to prevent it growing further and further. But it's something that is still happening today. I'm going to stop and see if anybody wants to say anything real quick, Nathan.
It's one quote, actually, a couple of things, but one thing that David said about bipedalism, and it reminds me of that great question: what came first, bipedalism or entropy? And one gave rise to the other. Which one?
Right.
And they're actually both dependent upon each other. And so that's like an open question to the group.
Right.
And also, as Africa being like, as a repository, and it really is. It's a repository in so many ways of history on life on this earth, and it's all there. So, and those are just open questions, comments to the group.
Right. And just to follow up on your comment, I mean, for example, cattle, today everywhere you go in the United States, you see nothing but black Angus, black Angus, black Angus. Well, that's a problem because, for example, in Africa, there's a lot of species of cattle that are specific disease resistant or drought resistant, or, have evolved and have been selected for, surviving various climates. And the more we replace those kind of diverse cattle with one particular breed, the more humanity is exposing itself to potential catastrophe if there's a disease that, spreads throughout the planet, or if there's some sort of a climate zigzag like what we're seeing today. I mean, if you look with what's happening in Europe today, yeah. Go ahead, Nathan.
Right. So you're speaking of cattle very briefly. So the Acholi cattle that are in Eastern Africa, they're very much they're essentially one of the breeds that the longhorn cattle here in America was developed from. They're very drought and desert resistant, and they have these huge horns. And so one of the big questions is why do these cattle have such huge horns living in an area where the resources are supposedly so scarce? Why do they grow their horns so big? Well, one of the reasons is that amongst animals that grow horns are actually heat radiators. They have massive blood flow that flow between the horn and the connective tissue and the bone of the skull. And so they act as massive heat radiators. So the bigger you grow your horns, and you see this through all kinds of African mammals, the more you can radiate heat. And it's not just about trophy presentation or sexual prowess. It's about survival.
I'm trying to make this picture work, maybe. There. Is this what you're talking about, Nathan?
Yes.
Yeah. Just so people have an idea of what is being spoken of here.
Yeah.
But yeah, and I know there's other cattle breeds in Africa that, for example, like have various diseases. I don't remember which ones right off the top of my head, but yeah.
Mhm.
So that's our first.
Just really, really briefly. Sorry to interrupt. That map that you showed, where it showed what Africa looked like when it was actually a savanna.
Mm-hmm.
Where was that from?
This
Where
one.
did you get that? Where'd you get that?
Let me show it real quick. Make sure we're talking about the same one.
With the lakes and the sun.
Yeah, I'm pulling that up right now. This one.
Yes, that one.
That's from Yandex.
From where?
Yandex, that's a Russian browser that actually allows you to download pictures unlike Google.
Okay. The only Western European information about Africa and the history of the ecosystem in Africa, it just shows you all desert. It doesn't show you what this was.
Right.
And it doesn't show you that there was savanna. It doesn't show you there were grasslands. It doesn't show you that there were lakes, rivers, and it doesn't show you that. And so, like, one of the great questions is when you go to the Anidi Mountains in Chad, and you find water pools with crocodile in them. Where did it come from?
We're going to talk about that next, actually.
Right. So again, like what you said, Africa is a repository for this. You know, that history is written and it's there, and remnants of it remain.
Absolutely. By the way, here's the reference where this map is from. And I can send you a copy of that.
Okay. Yeah.
But yeah. Okay, let me exit out of that. So since you brought up Chad, I was going to do it a little bit later, but let's do the Chad Lake, because that is another interesting thing that I think we're going to go over time. We might have to do more than one episode, actually. But okay, so Lake Chad, and here's what's going on with it. Another one of the sources, you said, why do you find pools? Well, because there used to be basically an internal sea called Chad. What we have left of the Chad Lake today is little dry droplet. This is something that's been, so about 2,000 years ago, from what I understand, there was an event that caused it to kind of fill up. If I understand right, it was a meteor strike or something like that. My geology is not my strongest point. But this shows even what's been happening just over the past couple of years, literally past couple of years in geological terms. I mean, the Chad Lake has been pretty much drying up down to nothing. So that's something that was an enormous internal, wait, where am I at now? Yeah, that's another reconstruction of what it might have looked like at its heights. What we have now, again, I'm going to go back one more picture to show you guys, because that is another crucial region. I mean, to where now what we have, you know, most recently is this right here, pretty much no water at all. But what's happening is all these regions are filling up with various vegetation. But yeah, the form, that right there, the next picture, but that was the Lake Chad Basin, according to one of the scientists researching it. I mean, it was absolutely enormous internal, basically freshwater sea. So let me talk about Chad real quick, since we got to it. So in Chad is where the thing known as pastoralism and the domestication of one of the many places where there's domestication of cattle happened. But the domestication of cattle was very different than what was happening. Fertile Crescent, Sumeria, all those places. Sorry, we have a janitor who's banging on the door severely over here. But anyway, kind of different than what was happening in the other parts of the world, where these people were not nomadic in the sense that, you know, the Europeans later on are going to be nomadic, where they had enormous herds. They would drive back and forth, eating up pretty much whole territories. These people had small herds, and they did not. Maybe they were like Indo-Europeans were like in the very beginning, when Zoroaster was first writing his Avesta, when he was saying not to kill the cow, because these people did not kill their cows. They lived with their cows, and Zoroaster would have very much liked them. Very early, they developed tolerance for lactose tolerance, and they used a lot of milk products. If they needed additional nourishment, they did not slaughter their cows. What they did is what a lot of other cultures did, a lot of the herding cultures did later on. They would basically open up a vein on the cow and take a little bit of blood, not enough to harm the cow or to injure the cow in any way. They would mix it with the milk, and and they would get a nourishing drink from that admixture of blood and milk. That was something that was fairly common. And they did not go very far distances was there. They didn't have large herds, and they didn't have to kind of drive them back and forth. They kind of more or less sedentary within a limited area. They did not, however, seem to be very interested in switching over to agriculture. So they did switch over to animal husbandry and to basically having cattle, but they were not interested in agriculture in the sense of any sort of crops, because in that region, a lot of those crops grow naturally, and there's absolutely no use and no need to go through this complex process. I mean, they use those crops very extensively early on. They used those crops very extensively in their diet, but they did not actually cultivate them in the sense that, we're used to cultivation of crops. They were just interested in gathering the wild stuff. But I want to go back to the stuff where I was starting with. So the three main sources that we have really of peoples, of kind of progress, of culture. And you got to remember, there's a lot we don't know about Africa. First of all, there's a lot I don't know about Africa, but there's a lot we in general as people don't know about Africa, because it just simply has not been studied yet, hasn't been excavated, is buried under sands. A lot of old settlements in Africa are buried under newer settlements, as is often the case, but much more so in Africa than anywhere else. And also a lot of just archaeological sites have been looted and lost. So one of the original regions of sources of culture in Africa is Ethiopia. It seems to have been settled for a very long time. They have their own crops in Ethiopia. And of course, these pictures, again, a lot of the stuff we're looking at is medieval cultures, their medieval buildings and so forth. But Ethiopia is such a unique culture now. Of course, we know that there's some admixture between the chthonic Ethiopian population and the various migrants throughout the ages. But Ethiopians are very unique culture in their own way, and is something that persevered throughout time. This is more, I don't know how many people know that, but Ethiopians are Orthodox. They have their own form of Orthodox church that's not in any way related to the Slavic Orthodox churches or the Greek Orthodox church. Theirs is older. It's very different. It has a lot of Judaic elements in it, but that's modern, of course, population. We're talking about very, very ancient population here, when those regions were also much wetter. This was before Sahara advanced. Not that this is in any way close to Sahara, but the same climatic change that affected Sahara affected these regions as well. Agriculture seems to have originated there. One of the sources of agriculture on the African continent. They have no stories of any sort of migration. A lot of people have stories about how their forefathers came to the region. These people believe that they were very much local peoples. They have very unique look to them. This is some of their, of course, again, these are medieval constructions, but I just wanted to show you guys a little bit what they look like. Ethiopians, very distinct, very warlike culture, extremely advanced, was their own state, was their own, later on, of course, they formed their own state. They were, during World War II, they were able to resist Mussolini's advancing troops, with sheer willpower, a king, and, military skills. I mean, eventually they did lose, but I mean, they did stand off for a long time against the Italians during World War II. I mean, Ethiopians are very unique, very special peoples. They, one of the, areas of Africa where early on the use of bronze was adopted. They have developed their own unique culture. They, as far as artwork and all that stuff goes, there's a good indication that they might have domesticated at least some form of banana type plants. They have their own unique form of bananas that are called enset. It's a banana-like plant. They're gigantic bananas from what I understand. There's some indication that donkeys might have been domesticated somewhere near that region anyway, very early on. And they grew a lot of various crops. I mean, the wheats, oats, tubulars, all kinds of things. So that's one of the sources of culture, definitely. Because Africa has so many little regions, with each one with its own unique peoples, its own unique language. I might do a whole separate episode on just the linguistics of Africa, because I really like linguistics and I find them to be very, very interesting. Okay, that's going to be, bottom line is we will talk about linguistics next time. How about that? Yeah. The second one, the second area that I want to talk about is the Niger River Valley, which is really, it's one of the very key regions to the African continent. First of all, we don't know a lot about that region because of the swampy nature of the Niger River Basin and just the climate there in general. But the fact that people live there, that people cultivated various, because it's one of the few places when there's a lot of sources of water in Africa in general, where people, you know, there's the Chad Lake, there's the Lake Victoria, you know, and the Great Lakes, there's the Niger and Congo River. Basically, the river valleys and the big lakes is where you kind of find the highest blooming of life. The agriculture seems to be mostly based on beans and not so much on, you know, crops because, yams. Well, yams are throughout Africa, and these are not the same yams as we have here. These are different. These are African yams, which is called different kind of plant. But they also cultivated beans, more so because you couldn't really grow crops in that region. We don't know a lot about that region, but we do know that a lot of culture seems to have origin. Melon, no, I think melon was in Chad.
Maybe.
But I mean, I'm sure a lot of it, and here's the thing. If you move away from the rivers or the bodies of water in Africa, you have a problem. Various cattle, I didn't mention, what was the name of that cattle we were just looking up? It seems like different African cultures at different times try to domesticate various things that to Europeans seem to be very strange, from animals to various crops. A lot of, you know, savannah is not the most, first of all, only 8% of the African continent is fertile per se for crop growing in general, roughly, which presents a problem. So and also it seems that African peoples tried to tame and to domesticate a lot of different things like various, and that was one of the reasons why scientists were able to prove that these were kind of chthonic. They were basically African-based civilizations that were not introduced from somewhere else, because in different regions of Africa, we will find signs of peoples trying to domesticate something that Europeans would never even consider to be a food crop. Or animals that Europeans would never consider to be something for domestication. I mean, that's why the Africans were able, for example, to domesticate the African ass, which is not easy. I'm sure it's not the easiest animal to domesticate. I mean, there's a big question of to what degree dogs originated and where they originated, but the fact that there's certain populations that most likely originated from some sort of African wolf species is likely. For fiber, for example, in the Niger River Valley, there was a palm tree. I'm going to try to pronounce it. I'm not going to guarantee that I'm pronouncing it correctly, but it's Raphael, a palm tree that was used for very strong, very dependable fiber that could be used for rope weaving, for cloth making, and all that other stuff. It seems like people in Africa were really trying to use the environment to their advantage as much as possible. And while the environment was plentiful and giving, like the Sahara, which used to be really a very, very thriving environment, which dried up, unfortunately. The shores of the Chad Lake, which used to be, again, a huge body of water that, again, evaporated. Another problem you have in Africa as far as agriculture goes, as far as, crop agriculture goes, is that when you have such hot temperatures all year round you only have 2 seasons, right? I mean, in a lot of places you have the rains, and then you have pretty much the hot season, and the dry season and the wet season, which, and it's hot all the time. And oftentimes the top layers of soil, they simply erode and blow away with the wind. So finding locations where you can settle down and you have enough rain to be able to grow stuff, but not so much that you're flooding or swamping over. Another challenge that humans in general have faced in Africa, and it's a challenge which I'm surprised that human species in general does not have a defense against already. I mean, some people do, but majority of humans don't, and that's malaria, of course. Malaria and the tsetse fly. Now, malaria is, of course, spread by mosquitoes, and it's something that has taken out whole populations over and over and over, and only small percentage of humans have developed a genetic adaptation for that, to where they have, because the genetic adaptation to fight malaria causes a lot of other problems, health problems, so it's a kind of a give and take. And to this day, I mean, malaria just wipes out whole regions, and there's not really a cure for it. And the tsetse fly, okay, it causes a lot of unpleasant experience to humans, but it pretty much takes out cattle. And so having very little grazing territory for this cattle, and then having every time you pretty much domesticate the cattle, well, first of all, mosquitoes really like it when people can congregate in groups larger than 30 and live, in the same spot. I mean, mosquitoes really, really enjoy that. So they've tried everything to eradicate those mosquitoes, from, killing all the cattle to killing all the elephants to taking out the local bushes. Nothing works. I mean, mosquitoes just adapt and they continue to feed them people because they like people. And that tsetse fly feels the same way about human cattle. Well, yeah, any sort of cattle or, any sort of large domestic animals, because to them, that's just food. And so to where humans can avoid these deadly flies, at least theoretically to a certain degree, I mean, cattle is just completely helpless. So, any sort of large not agricultural, but kind of herding animal is pretty much helpless. And you have this little herd that you being very tender and loving towards it, trying not to ever slaughter, and just take a little bit of blood and milk, and then the tsetse flies come and you don't have a herd anymore, and then you have to domesticate something all over again. Well, that's not really encouraging. Yeah, I think we're going to need to continue with this because there's a ton we didn't even cover. But there's a lot of just different domestications attempts. And another interesting thing about, I just read a whole article on whether or not there was proper Neolithic period at all in Africa, and the authors, and this is a kind of a joint publication by multiple authors, experts on the early history of Africa. They basically argued that Africa does not have a Neolithic in the European sense, that African Neolithic does not include as much agriculture as the European Neolithic does, because simply the regional, the climatic conditions were not really conducive to that kind of, large-scale agriculture. Yes, James, did you want to say something?
Yeah, this kind of coincides with some theories I've read, geoclimatic theories about how you can trace human civilization based on latitude. And if you look at the globe, there is a swath of land just either north or south of the tropics. And in the North Hemisphere, there's a fair amount of land area that falls in this area. It's the Goldilocks area. It includes China, Middle East, Europe, and a lot of North America. But in the Southern Hemisphere, it just includes just a tip of South Africa, a little bit of Australia, and the tip of South America, but the rest of those continents are very tropical or equatorial. And historians have theorized that because of their climatic conditions, it has hampered the conditions that would help agriculture, building city-states, building trade, which leads to language which is written down, which is a really big development, and also resource development as far as minerals and things of that nature, and also the availability of animals that you can tame, like horses, steers, dogs, things of that nature, which you can use for domestic purposes. That's kind of one of the things it seems like you're leading to, and that's something that would be interesting to develop, I think.
No, and I agree with you. Well, and humans, wherever they go, they try to tame everything that they can tame, unless they already ate it all, like they did in the Americas, for example.
Yeah.
I think in Africa, because there's this whole theory that because the megafauna kind of coincided with the humans in its evolution, it managed to survive better than anywhere else because it already knew what it was dealing with and stayed away from those pesky and unpleasant human beings. We are running out of time, so I think we need to do another episode on Africa because I haven't even begun to cover. I covered less than half of material I wanted to cover in this one. I didn't even cover the unique metallurgy situation in Africa, and the whole situation was gold in Africa, and so on and so forth. Go ahead, Ryan.
I was just going to say, I was hoping that everybody would be okay with doing one more episode because I had a feeling, I actually had a question about, kind of for the group about the whole move into becoming bipeds, you know, hardcore bipeds, and what advantages that really would have had in Africa as things were changing. But maybe that's for the next podcast even.
Well, we can talk about that now. I mean, I don't think that's even necessarily for the next one. I mean, to answer your question, nobody knows.
Right.
I mean, that's the bottom line.
I mean, I guess I kind of have my own ideas, hypothesis, whatever, but it seems like, well, there are obviously a lot of advantages to being a biped. You know, for one thing, you know, it leaves your arms free to use tools while you're walking on your other two limbs. But it does seem like, you know, I really don't know what the advantage is, and I've kind of wondered what other people think about that move.
Well, and there are a lot of disadvantages to it. I mean,
Right.
I mean, the backache that humans oftentimes suffer, you know, first of all, the backache, the back injuries, just because the spine is now in a very unnatural kind of position. I mean, your ability to be able to transport yourself, as if one of your legs is injured, is severely hampered. If you have 4 legs and 1 leg is injured, you can still run, right? If you have 2 legs, you're kind of screwed, more or less. I mean, childbirth has become a very difficult matter for all bipedal creatures that are, you know, mammals, because the structure of everything is just rearranged. Mating, as a matter of fact, has become a severe problem. That's why human females, they have breasts, why they have developed, you know, bright pink nipples, bright lips, because normally you would try to signal to your male with your posterior regions, and when the posterior regions are inconveniently hidden, you have to switch to frontal copulation and move all of your attractive signaling over to the front part of your body, and enlarge the breast that kind of, according to some theories, imitate buttocks and so on and so forth. Just there's a lot of inconvenience with that stuff. What I want to know, sorry, I'm just kind of making a joke on the side, but what I want to know is what the heck what the humans thinking about when they lost their fur, because now the mothers have to carry their babies, and that's just annoying.
Yeah, being kind of a furry myself in general, I have to say that I can see the advantages to not having to deal with this. But then again, when I was living in the woods, you actually kind of appreciate having a lot of fur.
Well, and what's the point of becoming bipedal if you're going to immediately lose half of your population, which is the females, going to immediately lose all advantages of becoming bipedal, because now they have to carry their babies around with their hands, you know? Which just totally defeats the purpose, right? I mean, that's why I don't get this whole furless thing with humans. But
Advantage number 1 for bipedal, you get to see them coming.
That's it.
yeah, absolutely.
You know, this African savannah, that means a lot.
I mean, I personally am a proponent of the theory that bipedalism began as an arboreal trait, when early ancestors of humans would be walking back and forth on branches, as a lot of apes do. On basically bipedally walking back and forth, helping themselves with their hands overhead. That humans were not ever knuckle walkers or anything like that, like, for example, gorillas are, or chimps are. That humans developed more or less from that stance of walking on a tree branch. That's my belief. And then when the climate started changing, they were able to transfer that trait over to the savannah situation. But what the advantages are, I don't know. We'd have to ask God, and I don't think God is answering that question. But go ahead, Ryan.
Oh, okay, it's working now. I was going to say, I haven't thought about that possibility, but that would make some sense from my days of crawling around in the thick of the, not jungle, but the thick forest, you know, being able to use your arms up here while walking through trees and, you know, dangerous knife edges and whatever. I could see that. I thought that maybe it was more about how, as humans evolved more to, not just humans, but hominids in general, evolved to use tools that they would use with their hands. It's like, well, if your hands are free and you can walk on 2 feet, then that might be an advantage, but don't really know.
Yeah, there are multiple species of apes that are not even remotely related to hominids that over and over evolved the bipedalism, and it usually has to do with larger, well, first of all, with coming down of the trees. Second of all, was having to gather something with your hands. And these apes never developed tools that we know of. I mean, some of them on isolated islands and so on and so forth. So it has to do mostly with being on the ground, you know, having to gather things with your hands, like fallen, because when you're on the ground, you have to pick up your fallen fruit from the ground pretty much, and a larger body weight usually. Let me go ahead and let David jump on.
That makes sense, actually.
Julie's very much right. Giganticus, I think, was
Giganticus.
yeah, was one of one of the lived 7-8 million years ago in Southeast Asia, I think.
And some say in there.
And some say in America, the Sasquatch folks. But he, again, was a giant ape that walked upright. But traditionally, or what I was taught 30 years ago, is Australopithecines moved into that. They were probably tool users like chimpanzees are tool users, but they were upright. They were only Lucy is the famous example of one from the great African Rift Valley. But it did give advantage of, in the African savannah, that really mattered, of being able to see what was coming. But it's probably also true that in the trees, think of orangutans and how they move in the trees. They're very much stretching and long, elongated arms. I even wonder if the apes and chimpanzees didn't evolve back down to knuckle walking.
Well, I think that was just a whole different branch.
Maybe, but I mean, they may have been more standing at one point, but there are significant disadvantages to bipedalism, particularly for childbirthing, because the optimal childbirth for a woman is to have wider hips, but the optimal bipedalism, that's why males tend to have narrower hips in proportion.
What I want to know is how the heck that early, since we just went on a little side spin-off on the bipedalism, what I want to know is how the heck that early, hominids in general outcompete the giant baboons that they were competing with. That's my big question in bipedalism versus quadrupedalism. Because at the time when Australopithecus were popular, because there was multiple groups of them were populating the savannah. They were competing with the baboons, and these were giant baboons. Now, think about a baboon, okay? This is a formidable, very evolved ape that has giant, basically fangs. It's basically a saber-toothed monkey, right? They live in very large groups. They're extremely militant, very aggressive, well-organized. When a baboon troop marches across the savannah, I mean, I don't know if you've ever seen that, but if you've seen that, that's like a military operation. You know what I'm saying? You've got your young males up ahead, you've got your big males, flanking the females. You've got the females marching in the center. Everybody's in their position, marching and, basically boom, 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 almost like an army. They're capable of taking out lions when they're in large groups. They're very evolved, very well adapted, and they quadrupedal, but they still are capable of doing things with their hands as far as eating the same resources as no, they're monkeys, but doesn't matter. I mean, they're monkeys, but you're right, they're monkeys, they're not apes. But baboons are pretty formidable creatures. And we're talking about baboons that were like twice the size of the modern baboons. I mean, I still want to know how humans outcompeted those seriously. That part I will never understand.
Julie, I will counter that by saying all of your examples of how organized they were and how aggressive they were refer back to human Homo sapien behavior. And I'll say Homo sapiens were probably better at the military organization than they were. That individually, the baboons were probably pretty fearsome, but as a group, which is Homo sapiens' real calling, group activity, they were probably pretty badass. And that's probably where their advantage lay.
James, in this case, I just must say that you have never seen a marching troop of baboons, because baboons invented Roman-style legions way before there was a Roman Empire. I mean, humans were still wandering in little bands of no more than 30 individuals. These monkeys marched in troops of, 300 and up. And if you've ever seen a troop of modern baboons numbering 300 march across the savannah, that's a formidable sight. I mean, I think Nathan can confirm that's pretty scary stuff to look at.
Oh, they're impressive. There's no doubt. They're intimidating, and but I'll have to give James the nod here. And there are a number of things. One, I think Homo sapiens, they started to, because of bipedalism, they were able to exploit an environmental niche that the baboons were not, but still maintain a very commanding presence in the same environment that baboons were effective in. So with that, and you talk about, you said, when you're standing upright in comparison to our body size, standing upright and you can see what's coming, you can also see what you're going after before they can see you. You're a better hunter. You're not just better at defending yourself, you're a better hunter. And also it goes into our development of eyesight. And that is, we see a different color spectrum. Now, animals, they see different spectrums of light than we do, but we see others, and that's another advantage.
Hold on. Sorry, let me jump in this, my horse. Nathan, on the one hand, I do agree with you. On the other hand, I mean, I think that the bigger factor here was really the diversification of diet for early hominids going to meat, consuming meat, which is something the baboons typically, I mean, they do have side, all primates have, side snacks of various meat, but I mean, it's not their primary diet. But as far as the color vision, I mean, that's something that all apes have, and actually majority of monkeys have. That's one of the primates, because all primates are pretty much diurnal animals. They all have that sort of colored eyesight.
Right.
That's something, because they have to be able to pick out various fruits and plants and so on and so forth. So guys, we are almost 15 minutes over. Did you still want to jump in? Or?
You basically covered it.
Okay. Does anybody else have any thoughts or anything like that at this point in time? Okay. Next time I'm going to find a video of marching baboon troops. Just in the place where I used to vacation as a little girl, there was basically a baboon research facility where they were kept in large quantities, and I went there as a little girl, and I was quite impressed. Giant baboons.
Atlas was this tall, and Erectus was, 6 foot tall.
Have you seen? Yeah, and giant baboon was about that tall and quadrupedal.
Yeah.
I think a lot of it was climatic change, actually, that probably also took them out. And then I think I might want to include some linguistic stuff in the next one, because that's just, I find the comparativistics method of very, very interesting, just in general linguistics, not the Western calculational statistical linguistics, but when you start talking about comparativistical linguistics, it's pretty interesting to me. They find some interesting stuff. All right, guys, so I will see everybody same place, same time on the 29th. So I'll send out the invites, and it's really good to see everyone. Thank you for taking part.
Thank you.
Bye.
Everybody be well. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
That exist within every man's soul, and we will live forever, or as long as stories are told. We are the archetypes that exist within every man's soul.